Hello, music makers. Welcome back. So, sampling is a key part of dance music history, and if you're a DJ who wants to start making your own music, it's the obvious place to start. But it can be tricky getting multiple samples to work together. Working for various DJs over the last decade, I've often been asked to troubleshoot samples. So I thought it would be useful to show why certain samples don't fit together, even when they're in the same key. Give you a look under the hood, as it were, and offer you a few tips and tricks for ways around it. Let's go. If we take a look at how most samples are labelled these days, we get just two bits of useful information: tempo and key. Now, as you might imagine, music is a little bit more complicated than just a number and one of 7 letters from the alphabet. So this is an overview at best. If I had my way, sample labelling would look a little bit more like this. I believe this is the minimum amount of information you would need to make samples work together. For these are the 3 main reasons your samples aren't working. Let me explain each of the problems first, and then we'll go through some solutions at the end. Okay, I have a piano sample here labelled Piano Loop Romantic B. Let's have a listen. Yes, very romantic, but what does this B mean? What does being in the key of B really mean? Because if I just press the note B on my piano, it doesn't sound very romantic. Now, obviously, if you've ever seen a piano player play, they don't just play one note, do they? They play lots of notes. So maybe it means that there's just lots of Bs. Let's put in all the Bs. A swarm of Bs, if you will. Nope, that's not it either. So what's going on? Well, if we look under the hood, this is what's really going on. So, as predicted, lots of notes, but most of them aren't B. There are Bs in there, but what's going on with the rest? The truth is, what being in the key of B actually means is it can contain any number of these. So B is not one thing. A sample in the key of B can contain any of these 7 things. A key is just a set of 7 notes, and any song or sample in a given key just means it could be made of any of them. We don't know which, when, or where. And to make things worse, the name of the key does not even imply that that note is the most common note. In fact, it doesn't even guarantee that that note is present at all. Okay, so that's a bit weird. A key is 7 things, and we don't know which ones. So surely the point of a key must be that those 7 notes all work well together, right? That would make sense. Here's what those 7 notes in B sound like together. No. I wouldn't call that good, would you? Well, maybe good for certain purposes, like maybe the score to a horror film? No. What a key is good for is when these notes are used individually, they can make coherent melodies. I'm not saying that's a good melody, but it makes a lot more sense than when they were all playing at the same time. And the other thing the key is good for is for making chords. Now, a chord is just a stack of simultaneous notes, but not that mess of all 7 we heard earlier. There's a pattern to this. If we leave a gap between each note, and making sure we stick to those 7 notes of the key, this makes a chord. And this pattern of notes sounds good. Now you can make a chord for each of the 7 starting notes in that key. So the key comes in handy when we are making melodies or chords, as long as these patterns are adhered to. Now, the problem is when you have one sample that is playing one of these chords, let's program a quick rhythm. Something like this. But another one of your samples happens to be playing one of the other chords. Remember, both of these samples are still in the key of B, but when we play them together, you end up with that mess we had earlier. Some chords do fit well together. Because there's only 7 notes, there are overlaps, and some of those sound really cool, but sometimes they don't. Now, I'm afraid I have more bad news, because it's not just a case of finding samples that sit on complementary chords. No. Samples that use chords often change them over time, what we call a chord progression. Have a listen to this piano sample. This is a different one. This one's in D minor. Now, if you can't hear that, this one's actually changing between 3 different chords. Let me show you what's going on under the hood. We've got this going on. These lowest notes actually show us where the changes are. Here's one, here's the next chord, and here's the last chord. And also, look at those note names. Even though we are in D minor here, we don't actually get to a D chord until halfway through. So not only is this sample changing chords, it doesn't even start on the home chord, the D. As I said with key, just because a sample is in a key does not guarantee that that note is even present. Likewise, any sample that has chords like this one, this D minor here, is no guarantee that there is a D minor chord in the sample. Remember, there are 7 possible chords in a key. And there's certainly no guarantee that the chord progression starts on the home chord. So, as you might imagine, trying to line up 2 samples from different places, even if they are in the same key, the chances of them having the same progression is going to be pretty low. Okay, so a simple way around this, you might be thinking, is only use one sample which contains chords. That way we should avoid any clashes, right? And that's not a bad idea, because if you think of what most music is made up of, speaking in very general terms here, of course, but we usually have drums, a bass, some kind of middle instrument like chords, and a lead, like a vocal or some other hook. So drums don't usually play notes. So if only one of these parts is actually playing chords, we should avoid most clashes, right? Unfortunately, it's not that simple, and the bass is to blame for this. To explain why bass is so special, I need to show you this. Listen to this piano playing a D minor chord. As we saw earlier, 3 notes create a basic chord, and as you can see here, the bottom note is the D. It's the bottom note that the chord is built upon. Music works from bottom to top. Any notes that appear above another note create a relationship, what we call harmony. The bottom note is the foundation of that relationship. Everything above it is built and heard in relationship to that lowest sound. Now, I'm not just talking musically, like building a chord with notes. I'm talking emotionally. Changing the lowest frequency changes the emotion. Let me give you an example. For this D minor chord, the most logical choice of bass note would be the D itself, right? Sounds good. Obviously, we knew that would work. However, without changing the chord above, what if the bass plays a different note? Listen to this chord again now with an A sharp at the bottom. It still works. This is a good relationship of notes, but it's not the same. The change in bass has actually forced this to be a new type of chord. It's no longer a D chord, it's an A sharp chord. Its real name is an A sharp major 7th, but you don't need to know that. The point is, the bass is the important one. Even if nothing else changes, changing the bass note changes all relationships above it. And as with life itself, some relationships work out and some do not. Okay, so with that in mind, let me give you an example. Have a listen to this bass part. Hopefully you can hear that has changing notes. This note, for example, is different to this one. So all we know is that it's changing notes, but it is in D minor. Now, here's that D minor piano sample from earlier. So both in D minor, let's listen to them together. It's not awful, but hopefully you can hear it's not great either. Something's not quite right. Now, this isn't a tonal thing. It's not because this bass sound doesn't work with this piano sound. This is a harmonic relationship thing. This is what I was alluding to earlier. Even though we don't have two chord parts clashing, this bass is much deeper than this piano. There's no note overlap here. But even though they are both in D minor, when their progressions don't match up, we can end up with some very bad harmonic relationships. Now, to prove it's not a tonal clash, let me show you what it sounds like when the progressions match. I've chopped up the piano to match the bass notes. Like that. Now, hopefully you're starting to get an idea why samples in the same key, or indeed tracks in the same key, can have so many incompatible differences. Now, all we've discussed so far has been based on the presumption that the sample has been labeled correctly, and unfortunately that's not a given. In fact, mislabeled samples are a lot more common than you might think. Now, this isn't just a case of somebody messing up. Those uploading samples are no different to you and I. Anyone who makes a sick-sounding sample doesn't have to know what it contains on a musical level. Luckily, there's no law saying those selling samples have to be musical experts or qualified in any academic way, thank goodness. But it can mean there is some guesswork here. But Ben, you say, the computer will sort that out. We have key detection technology now, right? Well, no, actually. In musical terms, we still don't have anything approaching the sophistication of the ear and brain combo yet. Not even the fabled AI. The best tech we have still gets it wrong 1 in every 4 attempts. And that's if the sample is clean. Say goodbye to key detection if the sample uses any number of popular lo-fi effects like bit crushing, for example. One of the reasons samples get mislabeled by humans or machines is because of chords. We talked earlier about how some samples may contain chords, multiple notes, basically. Well, there are some situations where certain notes will stand out more than others, like if the sample has been EQ'd, for example. And if that note is not the bottom note, not the root note of the chord, then it can be harder for someone or something to detect the real pitch. Here's a classic example. Have a listen to this bass line. Pretty reminiscent of a classic, French Kiss. Now this sample is labelled as being in A. But here's my recreation. If we look at what's really going on underneath, we can see the actual bottom note is a D. This sample is in D. But in the sample, the lowest note or root note has been weakened for whatever reason. Probably a high-pass filter or EQ move of some kind. And that has resulted in the software or the person detecting the A as the dominant tone in there and labeling the sample as A. Now the A note is in the chord of D, but it is not the root note. As I said earlier, this is more common than you might think, and you can start to see why. Being able to detect and identify multiple pitches in a sea of sound is something that takes years to train. And I've no doubt software will get there eventually, but we are not there just yet. So, what can we do? Well, chords only usually come in two flavors. You've probably heard of them, major and minor. And those chords have the same structure every time. Lucky for us, as I said earlier, there's a pattern to this. As you'll see here, the top note of a chord, regardless if it's major or minor, will always be 7 steps above the root note. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And it doesn't matter what the key is. Look, if we're in A, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The structure always remains the same. Here's a chord on F. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You get the idea. Now this is a minor chord. With a major chord, the only difference is this middle one. So the top note stays the same every time. 7 above. So, knowing this, if we suspect a sample has been mislabeled, it's not working with anything in key, our first guess can be that it's been mislabeled to the top note of the chord, as that one is the most common. So if we pitch our sample +7 or -5, same thing, that has a good chance of landing us in the correct key. As our sample here was labeled A, but was really in D, -5 gets us to A. Now, if your particular sample sounds too low at -5, we can go in the other direction. Remember, notes are on a rotation of 12, so +7 will also get us to A. But this one is the A above that one, what we call the octave up. Now, in the case that that doesn't work, we could presume it was mislabeled based on one of the middle notes of the chord. We won't know if it's major or minor, but we can use the same logic and pitch it in the opposite direction. In this case, you would need to try -3 or -4. Now, regarding samples that are, shall we say, on the move, ones with progressions in them, well, you can save yourself a lot of bother by finding samples that come in something called a construction pack, or stems. These are samples that are designed to work together already. However, these can be quite creatively limiting. And obviously, this is the easiest way to end up sounding like someone else if you've both used the same construction pack. Not a good look. So ideally, we want to be bringing in samples from different sources. That's a little tougher. I don't really have a reliable method of teaching you how to detect chord changes. That's just something you'll get a feel for over time. But there are a few hacks we can try. If we go back to our piano and bass example from earlier, so the reason these samples aren't working is because they're potentially moving in different directions at different times, and we don't know which. So we can help ourselves by limiting that movement. We can loop shorter sections, like this first bar of the bass here. Now this should stay still. Here's how it was before. Good, so we've stopped it moving around, but we still have a problem. As I said earlier, just because this sample says D minor, we still don't know what it starts on, or even if it's using D itself. Remember, it could be one of any 7 notes. So we still don't know what note this is. However, if we start with bass, there is a simple way we can find out, by using a tuner. Yes, I did say earlier that software isn't very good at pitch detection. But that is in the context of a complex signal, like a full track or something playing chords. Lucky for us, basses don't play chords. Basses are typically too low in pitch to get away with playing multiple notes at once. Chords just sound terrible down there. So bass parts are what we call monophonic, one note at once, and software is good at detecting monophonic pitch. This is also why auto-tune works, because humans can't sing chords. Well, with the exception of those Tibetan throat singers. Anyway, we can use our software's built-in tuner plugin to detect what notes our bass is playing here. So we saw there that the progression is D, F, G, and A. So by looping this first bar here, I have actually looped the bass on the note D. Now, tuners will not work on pianos. In fact, you don't have to take my word for it. Let's try. Yep, nothing. As I said, these are for monophonic instruments. It doesn't know what to do with that. Even a really sophisticated key detection plugin like Tonic by Z-Plane might struggle here. Well, it's got the key right, but it still hasn't told me which one of these changes is the D minor chord. So we're still in the dark. But now we have sorted the bass, what we can do is line the bass up with the piano. We're going to let the piano play back with the changes intact. And what we're listening for is when the two meet. If the piano also lands on D, we should hear that come together and sound at home. Did you hear it? It's this section. So if we loop that section now with our bass holding on D, and this piano sounds like it's doing the same, we should have a much more solid harmonic relationship between our two samples. These should work now. Let's listen. Much better. Okie dokie, hopefully you found that useful. I do have a favour to ask of you, and no, it's not the usual YouTube stuff. Where there would normally be a link to buy me a coffee is a different link to a GoFundMe. A close friend of mine and singer, Maria, needs our help. Unfortunately, this is not for a musical venture. She needs medical help. I'll spare you the details, but suffice to say, having been messed around by the UK's health service for the last 4 years, she has run out of time, and her only hope is a private operation, which she's seeking funds for. So if you were considering donating to me, may I urge you please divert that generosity to the GoFundMe for Maria. Thank you. Until next week, I'll see you in the comments as usual. Bye-bye.